I've been dreading this talk. I've been dreading this whole season of talks after what we would all probably say is good riddance in 2019. We didn't have it, I shouldn't say it, really bad. We had it bad. There's no way fans or blood about it. But after we got through the majority of our sensational flooding that we've seen across the state, we actually had it a lot better than most of our colleagues to the east. We definitely dealt with the wet weather, and we definitely dealt with a lot of those issues. But when you compare to what the folks to the north of us in the northeast that are still ongoing with their crops still in the field for much of the Dakotas and Minnesota and Michigan, I'd say that we were in pretty good shape. We actually had a nice set of dry weather this fall after some of the gloom and doom that we had from September through middle of October, and we caught up and basically bypassed many of our counterparts to the east. So the big question is, what does this all mean for next year? And I hate to show some of these graphics, so don't throw anything at me, please. I'm just going to try to do this as best as possible. One of the things that I want to, before we get into the main thing, is to talk about a term that has kind of eclipsed the Polar Express and now is the new meteorological term in the press, which is a bomb cyclone. So I thought I would give you just some brief introduction to the bomb cyclone. It's exactly what we endured this spring. And it's really just a meteorological term that may have been abused a little bit here in the last couple of years. Imagine that. We tend to abuse some of these terms. But really it's a simple process, and it really came out when we were looking at some of the severe weather that impacts the northeastern United States, and then these low pressure systems run up the coast. And we need a very strong upper air trough with a lot of divergence between temperature on the backside and the front side of that trough. You need that energy. And so really what it boils down to is we see a rapid intensification, almost like a bomb going off. And meteorological term, hence became a bomb cyclone. So the Meteorology Service tried to put some type of criteria to that, and the most common criteria that we see is a 24 millibar drop over a 24-hour period. Now, most folks aren't going to understand what a 24 millibar drop is, but to give you an idea, that'd be the same thing going from a tropical depression to a weak hurricane in a matter of 24 hours. So it's a very, very intense type of a system. The good news about these cyclones is they're well advertised in advance. Even with this flooding event, we had well over a week advance notice that this system was going to materialize. And what we tend to see in these situations is a consistency in the forecast. There's no deviation. Pretty much the model will lock onto a solution, and that solution will not change, and the path will vary. The variance in that path will be very minute over that period of time. For our region, we typically see this in the form of a blizzard. And we've seen many of these over the last few years here in the High Plains. In fact, in almost every single year that we can go back on the weather record, we see at least one of these bomb cyclones somewhere in the United States. So it's not uncommon. It's more uncommon for us because the vast majority of these occurred on the eastern seaboard, or in the instance that we've seen here over this last week, a system coming into California also deepening into a bomb cyclone. So when we see these things, the one thing that we need to cognitively recognize is that it's the underlying conditions that really put us at risk. It's not the system itself. It's what happened in the advance of that system and what are the impacts with that system with what was on the surface. In our instance, we're talking about snow. So when we look at this system, and I'm just going to show you a few quick graphics, and then we'll try to put the flooding to bed for at least the time being, until we get about 4 or 5 more slides down. But we had a very deep surface low. On the backside, of course, we had snow, we had an ice line, and then we had rain. We also had very high dew point measurements coming in from the south. And in fact, we had, preceding the event in southern Nebraska, we had a lot of fog. And where I'm from, when we get these type of heavy fog advection type of events in advance of the frontal system, we can lose a lot of snow in a short amount of time. And very little of it went off. It basically swept up into the atmosphere. So that's what we see here in southern Nebraska. Was in advance of this big storm system was we kind of had the big snow eater. So we got the rain, but we didn't have a lot of runoff with our system down in Lincoln. But as you got farther to the north, that advected moisture from that loss of snowpack helped to feed this system and energize the precipitation over northern Nebraska and northwestern Nebraska, as well as parts of the Dakotas. So this is kind of the streamline, and you can see the streamlines coming in from the southwest, wrapping up through northern Texas, going straight north up to the Dakotas, and then being brought back down. So bring that moisture up on the front side, overlied on that warm front, and the winds are still strong in the middle areas and upper areas of the atmosphere, so they brought it up, tapped that cold air, brought that cold air down. So it saturated that cold air, really waylaid the amount of precipitation that occurred in the western parts of the state. More importantly, here's that big upper air trough. We call these standing troughs. And when we get a standing trough, the one that drives all the way down to the Mexico border, and then brings the trough up toward the north, these are what are the classic formation of what we would need to see in order to get a large blizzard-type system developing in the center part of the country. So on the back side, you'll notice in the reds there, coming down the west coast, there's some darker reds and magentas. The condition in order to keep this system energized and explosive is a jet core on the backside. Typically, that will be in the 120 to the 150 range. On occasion, we'll see somebody move up to 180 miles an hour. So all those winds are coming down rather fast, and they converge on the backside of that upper air low. So all that energy is pushed into that backside of that low, and as it comes out, it diverges. So it evacuates that air in the upper atmosphere. The faster it can evacuate that air, the faster that surface low can strengthen. So basically you're moving air from the surface up through the atmosphere, and it gets to the top of the atmosphere, it has to go so quick. So it diverges out. That's normal formation of lows. But the stronger that divergence, the stronger that low pressure system. And so what will end up happening is that trough surface low progresses out ahead of the surface low. It'll reach up into what you can see in the south central portions of Minnesota. This is a classic surface track for these type of systems. And generally where we see the maximization of this pressure pattern is as that surface low gets up toward the western Great Lakes. And it starts to slow down as the upper air low itself gets too far displaced. We start cutting off that evacuation. But the main surface trough itself will slowly catch up. And as it catches up, we get into what we call a stack low, meaning that this low is made its maximum strength and it's going to start to weakening at the surface. We usually look at that as an occluded low. You'll see a low pressure system. And then you'll have your warm, your cold front on a line, and then you'll have a strong cold, warm front and a strong cold front. It's occluded, and at that point it starts to collapse. Thankfully for us, at least in the time being, there's none of these in the forecast. We would probably start to look at this type of a pattern more in earnest as we get into that mid-February period through the end of March period. And as you go into the western part of the state, there's about a 15-day lag in the length of the vulnerability of these type of patterns. They tend to be a little bit more higher in elevation, and they can tend to see these systems develop all the way through the middle to the end of April. Not uncommon for us to see those type of snows. So the big question is, as we go forward, and here's just a classic comma-shaped upper air low with a humongous dry spot pushing in, and the warmth that was necessary in front of that surface low is represented by this dry slot, and the moisture, you can see it right from the southern portion of Texas, and the cloud formation brings it all the way basically up into northern North Dakota, and then wraps it around on the back side. So, there's two things that come out of this cyclone. Of course, the massive flooding, and we're probably going to see several years before we completely recover, and it may even take longer than that with some of our infrastructure. More importantly, it set the stage up for our spring flood, and it was pretty extensive. There's no sense going into it. We've seen the results of that all across the Midwest with the prevent plant, the blazing planting, and of course officially, as we got that rainfall, the concern of an early freeze, what it would do to the crops. So we did put out a couple of releases this year in terms of our risk, and the one thing we noted, we were in actually a lot better shape here in Nebraska than many parts of the east, simply because we had a better planting window than the folks to the east. but we still carried a pretty significant risk. And in fact, thank gosh, statistics played in my favor this year. The indication was that we would not make it on those crops that were planted from June 1st and after across the northern half of the state. And the early freeze basically brought that to fruition. We didn't hit black layer in some locations, and we see more extensive missing of black layer far north of us, which bears the question how much of this is going to be an issue, just like when we went through in the, what, 2009, 2010 winter, when we had the wet crops, and in the spring we started to have a lot of grain issues, and of course we burned through grain pretty quickly. So we'll wait to see whether or not that occurred, but that winter outlook that you see here plays an important role because right below it is a NOAA flood statement, and these will probably be issued on a regular basis all the way through the spring. So last year I talked about the flood risk to the north was due to the very saturated conditions, and it was primarily an area across northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, and portions of a small portion of northeast Nebraska and southeastern South Dakota. If you look at this latest flood risk assessment, it basically triples the size of that area. It includes most of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, the northern half of Nebraska, essentially the I-80 corridor northward, Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan. So if we look at the context of the largest area of the Corn Belt that produces the vast majority of the grain in the United States, well over 80% of this area is represented under this flood risk for next spring. Does that mean it's going to flood? Does that mean we're going to see the same thing we've seen last year? Probably not, but there is a chance that those areas to the north of us, based on the patterns that we've seen so far this fall, will probably once again be on pins and needles as we go into the future. For us, I'm more happy to see some of these drier patterns materialize for us recently, although this last weekend was not what I would consider the things I want to look forward to going into the future. But when you consider how wet we were and how dry we become, and I'll show you a few graphics here to support that, at least from a standpoint, we do have a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, as long as we can keep things within a realistic time frame and we don't get inundated with a whole bunch of these one storm after another. So the reason I bring this up is that no issued their winter forecast in early October. It's kind of difficult to make a winter forecast. I had to make one for the Nebraska Cattleman magazine. They wanted it at the end of August. Thankfully, they waited another month because they had some other issues that came up, and we delayed it until we could rewrite it. I didn't change it much, but it's bad enough trying to forecast the next growing season, let alone trying to forecast the next winter when you don't know what the pressure patterns are going to be in the fall. But what I will tell you about this map here is if we see this edition compared to the revision, this revision compared to October, in October the only area that was showing EC on this map was essentially the area, the northern half of Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, and up through Michigan. And I questioned that because of some of the cool patterns we've been seeing. And so I am happy to see that they brought the EC down to be more representative of the last 2 months of pressure patterns, but you'll notice an absence of below normal temperatures. I went through and did an analysis back to where you could get the very first of CPC's weather data on terms of these forecasts. So we've got about 20 years of data that we look at CPC's forecast and look at the areas of the country that have below normal temperatures. And so this is a word of caution. You see no below normal temperatures. Only one time in the last 15 years have we had an area in the country that didn't have a significant below normal temperature trend. And that year, the only area was in the southwest, basically around Las Vegas, down into the Flagstaff area. So to see a map like this, you should scratch your heads a little bit because this is a big country and we would expect in any given year there's going to be some below normal temperature. So we've been questioning this forecast, especially when you consider that this precipitation forecast is pushed down a little bit farther south than the previous forecast, but it's still fairly consistent with the first forecast. Now, I don't know about you, but I do know that if I see an above normal forecast and I'm in the Dakota, I'd be really worried about this type of forecast. Even with normal temperatures, you're going to get a lot of snowfall. Well, if you get a lot of snowfall on the ground, any air masses coming down from Canada are going to fall over that snowpack, and it's not going to get modified. So we're at a loss to some extent to understand why CPC is going with its forecast, considering the trends that we've seen the last couple of months. So here's your October trend. Well below normal temperatures for the western half of the United States, above normal along the eastern United States. Then we move to the month of November. Basically all areas east of the continental divide, below normal temperature. In fact, in that October through the mid-November period, Omaha went 24 consecutive days with below normal temperatures, due to a very strong upper air trough over the eastern United States. And we had two modes of action with it, and I'll get into that in a minute, because those are probably the two modes that we'll deal with the most this winter. And for us, at least in the southern half of Nebraska, these two modes are actually favorable for colder temperatures, but also favorable for below normal precipitation for us. That would be a benefit considering how wet the soils are. But as a climatologist, any given month can change, and it's really the sequence of months together that tell the whole tale. So we take the whole tale of these 2 months put together, you know, this is the winter, but this is our fall leading up to it. We see a fairly substantial area of the country seeing below normal temperatures. And so for me, this forecast is kind of a polar opposite of a trend that we do see. Now, yes, we are seeing some nice weather, and don't have a problem having all of December warmer than normal. Don't have a problem having all of February warmer than normal, or March warmer than normal. But I will caution you that last year, December and January, across all of the upper Midwest and Central Plains were well above normal, yet we ended the winter below normal, because we had from Nebraska northward anywhere from the 1st to the 7th coldest winter on record since 1890. So I felt really good about my forecast until February, and then I was made a fool of it. Mother Nature does that to us climatologists on quite a few occasions. So, you know, even though I'm going to give you a few options here, remember that I'm probably going to be wrong. This to me is the important trend. If you look at where October bared out, the areas that have been persistently wet just got re-wetted. So we start to dry out. People are feeling pretty confident. I should say C-O-C-K-Y cocky, and some suspenses about how things were finally working in their way, and then it all fell apart. And then we follow it up. In November, we did have some drier weather, and we seen a pattern shift to a wetter pattern to the southwest and the Intermountain regions. It was a very dry pattern in the Central Plains. In fact, we are seeing some portions of Kansas, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and Texas Panhandle that have had an issue in terms of dryness and getting their wheat planted and up in a timely fashion. So what we are seeing, if you remember last year when I showed these maps, really most of the southern half of the United States was wet, the northern half was dry. We're actually flipped this pattern. The wetness has shifted toward the northern half of the United States, and it's been a much drier pattern across the southern United States. So when we look at the total precipitation trends, the southeast is getting wet. We got a little bit of wetness in the southwest. Now, remember, this is a desert environment, so a single major storm system here can really throw your statistics off for a couple of months. But you will notice the same locations that have been battling a wetness issue for the last several years continue to be wet. Minnesota, the Dakotas. In fact, I would be shocked to see what is remaining in terms of the corn up in the Dakotas. I would be shocked if what remains 50% of it is harvested before next spring. Basically, we have snow on the ground, and even if we melt that snow, at this time of the year, we just don't get enough warmth to dry things out in those heavier soils. Most likely are going to be very mucky. Not as much tiling up into that region, so my suspicion is it's going to take a good hard ground freeze before we can see much activity. And then we're going to have to lose the snowpack. So speaking of snowpack, you can see a fairly extensive band from northwest Nebraska all the way up into the Dakotas. But I would draw your attention to the eastern Montana and northwestern North Dakota, and then points to the north. The absence of snow cover is particularly concerning for me in this region, not so much from a moisture standpoint, but from being exposed and north of the mean jet stream there in the colder air. We're going to set some pretty significant frost depths in this region before we put extensive snow cover on top of it. Now, that area is not really of a major concern for us, particularly in southern Canada. That's going to go up the Red River Valley. But for me, what is a concern is that if we get these Arctic air masses over top of ground that has had a deep frost depth, we just aren't going to see a moderation of that. And then if we throw snow on it, that's going to intensify that cold and push it southward. And then we have this layer of snow just to the north of us that is already built in. And the biggest question is, will we see sufficient amount of time for the snow to disappear? And I would argue that, yeah, they're going to see some nice weather next week. They better get rid of most of it, because then the cold comes in and the opportunity to lose that snowpack disappears rather rapidly. So we've got the surface conditions basically figured out. Now we look at the Equatorial Pacific. Last year, we were talking about the cold portion of the eastern Equatorial Pacific and the warm in the central Equatorial Pacific. You can see that that had pretty much stayed status quo up till just recently when we started to die out. And I'll give you a static picture of this. You can see a little bit of cold in the eastern Equatorial Pacific and a few pockets starting up at the surface just to the north and south of the Equatorial Pacific. But most of it is above normal. And we also have a very strong above normal pattern in the Gulf of Alaska. And I'm going to be straight up and honest, I was calling for this pattern to break down much quicker than it is. I thought for sure that we were going to start to see the cold fill into the Gulf of Alaska and beyond to our beginning stages of a developing La Nina event. That looks at this point to be on hold for a while, although the numerical models are indicating a cooling trend as we get to the second half of the year. We'll wait to see. But there's a lot of warmth in the Gulf of Alaska for these storm systems, so it really boils down to where is that track. Last year, that pocket of warmth was located just, I'd say, about 300-400 miles to the west. So those low pressure systems were forming on the eastern Aleutian Islands, and that energy was getting stripped out and injected underneath of the blocking ridge in the eastern Gulf of Alaska, coming into the southern stream. This year, because this is displaced a little bit farther to the east, we are not seeing the undercutting of those storms to the extent of last year. So instead of having more southern stream storms, we're having more northern stream storms. As that ridge is displaced to the east, that brings that cold air down the front side of the Rocky Mountains into the northern plains. So, as we look underneath of the Equatorial Pacific, you'll notice there's a big warm blob that's coming up to the surface right now. Behind it is a cold pattern. Last year, when our Arctic air started to infiltrate into the region in early February, we've seen the cold pocket develop in the eastern Equatorial Pacific. I'm going to go back one slide if I can. Oops. We've seen that cold develop in the eastern Equatorial Pacific in early February. That is the same time that we energized the jet stream pattern and seen the cold air infiltration coming in to our region. This warmth that just started to show up is also started to show up as we started to transition in the middle of this past month into a little bit warmer and wetter pattern with these storms coming into the southwest. So based on how fast that pocket is moving northward, and we'll go back to this, how fast that pocket is moving toward the surface in the eastern Equatorial Pacific, we've got probably 2 to 4 weeks left of this energy in the eastern Equatorial Pacific before it starts getting transferred to the central Equatorial Pacific, and that cold pocket comes up behind it. It is that time that most likely we'll see a phase change in the pattern, moving toward a more colder pattern in the eastern United States. There are some hints that will start developing as early as next week and then get reinforcing cold air after it. And as that energy moves out into the central Equatorial Pacific, we have to be consciously aware of that will help these supersized storms coming into California. Now, there may not be as many of them, but those that come in will probably have a lot of moisture to work with and will produce those occasional big systems that cross to the southern plains and impact at least the southern half of Nebraska. So when we look at the consensus forecast from CPC, you can see that there's a red and a blue and a green line. This is kind of the summary of the different numerical models, dynamic, statistical, etc. They all point to the same statistical pattern. A slight decrease in temperatures, and then the last one on the very right side is the beginning of next winter. So we're basically coming into the neutral side of the equation. Now this has changed dramatically in the last 2 months. They were keeping us much warmer later into the fall, but they're starting to cool this down. Now, you've heard me talk in the past that if we get into La Nina type patterns, drought frequency in the northern and central plains starts to increase rather dramatically. simply due to high pressure ridge aloft to the west shutting off the flow of moisture, making it up into our region. So this would be one of those things that we've been paying attention to. If this verifies the most likely scenario for dryness and consistency within the Central Plains, will most likely be the second half of the year. If this verifies out. If it stays on the warm side, then we are probably going to stay more in a moisture atmosphere, and unfortunately that will mean above normal moisture. So I've got it covered both ways. I gave you your drought, I gave you your wet. I'm fully covered. Half of you will think I'm right, half of you will think I'm wrong, and the next year, but vice versa, I'm always perfect that way. So, I want to give you 3 modes that we've seen this fall as a precursor to what we most likely will see going forward in the future. The biggest question, what is going to be the dominant force? Meaning, which of these applications I'm going to show you are going to rule the roost? I think it's going to be more Arctic air, but my thoughts are my thoughts. Take it with a grain of salt. First and foremost, this is an example of the pattern that we've seen where we get the system that broke off from the mean flow. Like, try this view. You notice the upper air low situated over the northwest. These are lows broke away from that mean flow, and it slid down to California, carved out a big deep trough, and then ejected. Each of these systems so far this fall that are coming to California into the southwest and ejected have primarily moved in a north-northeasterly direction to the Dakotas. This has been their big wet system type pattern. Brings a lot of warmth up. We tend to see more rainfall here. Most of the snow gets confined to the northwestern part of the state and points off toward the north. The second example is a system which we dealt with for the vast majority of that period from October to the middle of November. And that is a strong ridging pattern coming up in advance of that low in the Gulf of Alaska, pushing a ridge well up into the northern Canadian Rockies, bringing that cold air right down the front side of the mountain. Now, in this situation, a low pressure system digitally develops on that trough and continues to move down the front side of the Rocky Mountains. And we've seen that with the big snowstorm here along the Front Range a few weeks ago, where we had big, heavy snowfall across the western 1/3 of our state, all the way down the Texas Panhandle, and then that system carved out and moved up toward the western Great Lakes. And then the third example is a much further eastward displacement as the ridge sits over the western United States. As that low pressure pushes in on these occasions, most of the cold air comes straight down to the eastern portions of the Dakotas, Nebraska, all the way down into Texas. And then that system carves out a storm that heads off to the eastern Great Lakes, impacts Illinois, Indiana, and the northeastern United States. And this usually is a type of pattern that eventually will produce one of our big nor'easters come up the eastern seaboard as that system progresses off the eastern seaboard. Modes 2 and 3 are ones where we would see below normal temperatures. Liquid equivalent precipitation would typically be below normal for the vast majority of the state, not necessarily snowfall. You get these little Alberta clippers, and if you get enough of them at 1 to 3 inches at a clip, it don't take long to get up to your 25 to 30 inch seasonal total. And we've already had a good start in some portions of the state already. So these are your 3 modes. I kind of think 2 and 3 are going to be the dominant modes. I suspect that if you're going to see more active weather coming out of the southwestern United States, as an example 1, it will be during this month of December. We will most likely move to a longer phase pattern of colder conditions that will set in once we get an established snowpack. And then that will most likely hold through a good portion of January before we start to turn to a stormier pattern. Now, the good news or the bad news is that these type of patterns can break rather quickly in the spring. And my suspicion, and it's just a suspicion, I don't have it based on anything else, but I've been in this business long enough, when we tend to work up, we're seeing a repeat of the same conditions the second year, particularly under a major flood event or a major snow maker, that things will probably go the opposite way. And the one thing I will draw your attention to is that really, this could have been a completely different season if we were given 2 good dry weeks of weather sometime between mid-April and mid-May. this might have been a whole different ballgame we've been dealing with here across the Midwest, because we certainly had a lot of moisture. It would have been at that point how much of it would have caused disease issues, how much would have had to been replanted from flooding out the field. But certainly we would have been off to a good start. And there really is some pretty impressive yields when you consider how late we planted this crop and what it was able to do, even with some of the stuff that was crofted early. The conditions were there with the moisture. It was just too much too early. So, thinking about that logically, we do know that a vast majority of the Corn Belt is sitting with doggone near full profiles, 2 full profiles. So there is a huge bank of moisture there. It's whether or not we're going to have inclement weather during that critical planting period into the early growth stages that is going to cause some additional problems. And most likely the areas that are most likely to receive this, based on the type of patterns that I'm describing here with this cold Arctic air, is going to be to the north of where they set a deep frost depth. I think that's going to be our biggest issue. If we can keep the ground from not setting a deep frost depth, even if we get a snowpack on it, we can slowly work from the bottom and the top as we start to see the sun go up on a solar angle during February, start working on the snowpack even if we don't get above freezing. But if we set a deep frost depth, that means we're most likely going to have a deep ice accumulation on our lakes, and that sets us up for the stage for some type of a condition where we get rain on top of that snowpack and release it. If we can release it over the general melt period that we typically would see, 7 to 10 days, we'll get some lowland flooding, but it won't be as extensive as what we've seen with that system. To put it in perspective, folks, really what this system did is we had a snowpack that had 1 to 2 inches widespread across a substantial portion of the northern half of the state. Some areas had over 3 inches of that snowpack. Then we threw another 1 to 3 inches of rainfall on top of it with a ground frost depth that was over 2 foot in most of these locations. And very extreme northern Nebraska was over 3 foot. So essentially what you would basically have was anywhere from 3 to 5 inches of water poured over 40 to 50 county area. And that 40 to 50 county area was just like that parking lot out there. There was no place for it to go, unfortunately. Hopefully, we don't see another one of these situations for many, many years, and hopefully the distance between these is many, many years, as it was the previous time, from mid-60s to this point. I think that's the last time we've seen such expensive flooding. And hopefully, in my career, it'll be the end of what I'll have to deal with. So as we look forward, understand that we have an elevated flood risk. It will be here all the way through spring. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there'll be some even more drastic statements issued by NOAA, particularly as we get into February and March, after we see how the snow is materializing the next 2 months. And again, our degree of flood risk is really going to be determined by the storm tracks. If the storm tracks are going to miss us to the south and miss us to the north, we're going to be in really good shape. But if we get 2 or 3 of these come across us and one after another and drop a couple feet of snow, it's a whole different ballgame. I got a lot of flexibility here in all the areas I can make this year in terms of forecasting, but there has been 3 modes of storm tracks. The 2 most dominant ones have both have a northerly component with Arctic air, and for us here, at least in the southern half of the state, those generally mean below normal precipitation. They do not necessarily mean below normal snowfall. The big difference this year to last year, again, is that most of the major precipitation events this fall and in the early part of this winter have been confined more toward the northern plains and less from the southern plains. That's a complete 180-degree shift from last year. And that's where I'm hoping that will help us as we get into our spring conditions. Now, ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation, consensus models are neutral. When they say neutral, that's plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So even though it's going to be neutral, it's going to be on the warmer side. The warmer side would help with some of the spring rains to the southern plains, but it may not be strong enough to overcome the big polar air masses that are likely to form over the eastern United States. So we have to be cognizant we're watching the southern Rockies for its snowpack. Right now it doesn't really matter because we don't even have any snowpack measurements. We won't have those for another week. The initial measurements. They did get a good snow on this first round, but they missed out on everything else. So my suspicion is they're going to see a below normal snowpack in the initial readings as we come out with that produced by NRCS. If that pattern continues, that dry pocket in Texas Panhandle all the way up into ports of the southwestern Nebraska will need to be watched because with that below normal snowpack, we would favor transition downstream from that area, increased drought risk as we go into the growing season and intensifying. So if we go into a cool pattern, we go in the second half of the year, and we have this drier pattern that has established itself to the southern plains, that would help to build that ridging pattern across the south toward the north, and may impact us more on the second half of the growing season than the first half of the growing season. The only other thing that I would caution is that if all of a sudden we start to see a rapid movement toward El Nino, which at this point doesn't appear to be likely, but just say it does happen. And we've seen it on occasion in the past where all of a sudden it'll start developing rapidly. In those years where La Nina is developing going into the spring, we tend to have an early break to warmer weather. The also pattern we have to deal with is when we break to early spring, typically our growing season tends to be longer, water use increases. That increases our drought risk, but the good news about that is it would also help to use some of that surface moisture and allow us a pocket, a period of about, depending on when the break is, anywhere from 30 to 45 days before we get into serious planting for our grasses and stuff to take some of that moisture out and move, make some movement for additional rainfall events that would reduce our flooding needs. So I'm doing a lot of wishing here because I really don't want to see a winter based on what we went through this last 6 months of precipitation. But I would be more inclined to take the cold over the precipitation. I think we'd be in much better shape that way. Yes, it will increase some of our feeding costs for our cattle, but in terms of the risk to the general overall state in terms of flood and some of the issues that have not been completely fixed from this previous spring's flooding, they're probably one of the better scenarios we can have. So overall, I'll give you a lot of scenarios. I'm really not zeroed in on anything. I do think that we're going to see a much colder winter. Not so much confined to February, but extended over a bottom portion of the winter we did last year. But we will still see those breaks. Because when you look at a pattern with a big trough and a big ridge to the west, any movement will bring that warmer weather in rather rapidly into us. So it would not surprise me that even with the Arctic air, we will see big shifts back toward the above normal temperature side. It's just that I think that the colder weather will be much longer lived than the shorter episodic periods of warmer weather when we get some of those storms coming into California and through the southern plains.